On February 12, 1945, at precisely 4:47 in the afternoon, the wooded hills near Epernay, France, were quiet in that heavy, listening way the world sometimes holds its breath before history bends. Beneath a crust of melting snow and frozen pine needles, a 22-year-old American infantryman named Jack Bigham lay flat against the cold, damp earth. The stillness around him was deceptive. Every sound carried weight. Every heartbeat felt loud enough to give him away. He was a sniper with the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, part of the 4th Infantry Division of the United States Army. A small piece of that vast, grinding machine inching its way east through a continent torn apart. The air of late winter hung thick with the residue of cordite, pine, and smoke. You could almost taste the metal in it. In Jack's steady hands rested a Springfield M19903A4 rifle, its wood darkened by cold and oil. It was a standard-issue American sniper weapon of the war, but the thing that made it remarkable, the detail that would soon etch his name into whispered recollection, wasn't the rifle itself. It was the scope. The odd, mismatched, hand-built scope, perched on top like an afterthought, assembled from pieces no one believed could belong together. It wasn't military grade. It wasn't even regulation. It was something he had built himself. And when his fellow soldiers first saw it, they laughed. The memory of their laughter still echoed faintly in his mind. They had called it a toy, a contraption, a death wish. The scope, after all, had once been part of a broken medical microscope, the kind you'd find in a school lab or a hospital, not a battlefield. A steel ring from a dismantled German artillery fuse held it together. The adjustment dials were marked with pencil notches, etched by hand. It looked absurd, amateurish. A science project, someone had muttered. A farmer's experiment. And maybe it was. Jack never argued. He just smiled that quiet Kansas smile and went back to cleaning the lens, steady and deliberate, as if he were tuning time itself. Yet 27 seconds later, just 27 heartbeats, those same men watched as a German Panzer IV, positioned more than down 200 yards away across the ridge, erupted into a pillar of fire and dust. The sound rolled through the valley like thunder over stone. It wasn't artillery. It wasn't an airstrike. It was one man, one bullet, and one homemade scope. The laughter stopped. What filled the silence instead was disbelief, a kind of reverence born not of spectacle, but of realization. Something extraordinary had just happened. This is the true and almost unbelievable story of Jack "Red" Bigham, the American soldier his comrades mocked for inventing his own sniper optic, until the moment he used it to change the course of a battle. It is a story about doubt, about the quiet insistence of ingenuity under fire, and about the single, impossible shot that carved his name into the frozen mud of France. Winter of 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was still burning through the Ardennes, like a fever that refused to break. The men of the 4th Infantry Division were exhausted, their uniforms stiff with frost, their boots worn thin by endless marches through snow and shell fire. By early February of 1945, the front line had crept eastward into the Champagne-Ardenne region of northeastern France. There, among the rolling hills and dark forests near Epernay, the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, known simply as 2-3, was tasked with probing the German defenses dug deep beyond the Bois de Ligny Ridge. It was the kind of assignment that looked simple on paper, but meant danger in every shadow. Among those men was Jack. He wasn't the loud one. He wasn't the type to bark orders or tell stories around the fire. He came from Marshall, Kansas, a farming town of fewer than 10,000 souls. Before the war, his hands had known the weight of wrenches and watch gears, not rifles. He was a mechanic by trade, a tinkerer by temperament. one of those quiet minds that see problems not as barriers, but as puzzles waiting for the right fit. At 19, he had apprenticed under his uncle in a small watch repair shop, spending long afternoons bent over open cases, breathing slowly so the second hands wouldn't tremble. He could rebuild a stopwatch blindfolded, adjusting the hair-thin gears until they sang in harmony. Customers used to joke, "That boy's got nerves made of ice." Maybe they were right. When Jack was drafted in the spring of 1943, those same steady hands caught the attention of instructors at Fort Benning. During marksmanship training, he didn't just shoot well, he thought differently. He adjusted for windage and elevation instinctively, measuring distances in his head using the lines of trees, fence posts, even the angle of shadows. But back then, there wasn't much room for creative minds in the infantry. There was no formal sniper program, and scopes were scarce. So Jack was assigned as a regular rifleman, another soldier in another green uniform. By January of 1945, after the snow-choked nightmare of the Bulge had ended, the Army began to realize how short it was on trained sharpshooters. Many scopes, Weaver 330C models mostly, had fogged, cracked, or gone missing entirely. Resupply lines were stretched thin. In 2-3, only 3 scoped rifles remained for the entire battalion. Where most saw limitation, Jack saw opportunity. He always had. In early February, stationed near Epernay, Jack quietly requested permission to visit the battalion's field hospital. The request didn't raise suspicion. After all, soldiers often needed equipment or just a place to warm up. But Jack wasn't after bandages or rest. He was after glass. There, on a supply table beneath a flickering lantern, he found it. A broken Bosch and Lum microscope, cracked during transport. He turned it over in his, hands, inspecting it like a jeweler inspecting a flawed diamond. Then, as if the idea had been waiting for him, he began to imagine its second life, not as an instrument of healing, but as a tool for precision, clarity, survival. He took the lens tube, fashioned it into an optical sight, and scavenged a steel ring from a destroyed German 88mm shell casing to hold it in place. 2 nights he spent working in the dim light of his tent, soldering, filing, balancing, each movement careful, rhythmic, patient. When he showed the result to his squad, their laughter came quickly and without malice, the way men laugh when the war has worn them too thin to imagine miracles. "That thing looks like it belongs in a science fair," one said. Another joked, "Hey, Big'em, gonna diagnose a germ or shoot a kraut." Even the platoon sergeant just shook his head. "Ain't regulation," he said flatly. "Don't come crying when it shatters on your first shot." Jack didn't argue. He simply nodded, wiped a smudge from the lens, and said nothing. He believed in the tool because he had built it, and because it was all he had. Out in the woods west of camp, he tested it alone, tracking tree lines, measuring drop, adjusting with his homemade dials. The scope wasn't perfect. The image had a faint bluish tint, and the zero drifted with the cold. The lens scratched easily, but it magnified, it aligned, it worked. It was fragile but true, like the man himself. He wasn't chasing glory, he was chasing utility. In an army where orders flowed downward and innovation came stamped with approval from above, Jack Big'em was about to prove the opposite. That sometimes the most vital inventions are born not in laboratories or factories, but in mud, under fire, in the hands of someone too stubborn to accept that good enough was all there was. He never asked for permission to build it. He knew better. In the Army, improvisation wasn't exactly encouraged unless it came from the top brass. What he did ask for, quietly and respectfully, was time. Time at night. Time alone. Time to make something better than what he'd been given, which was nothing at all. Those February nights in 1945 were cold enough to bite through fabric. Jack worked under a canvas lean-to beyond the tree line west of Epernay, the muted glow of his flashlight wrapped in red cellophane. a trick he'd learned from a medic's signaling kit. He muffled the sound of his tools with burlap and oilcloth. Every scratch of metal on metal was a secret shared only with the trees. In a small pocket ledger, he filled page after page with calculations, distances, crosswind drift, temperature effects. The handwriting was small and neat, the way a man writes when he knows paper is precious. He disassembled the microscope into 3 parts, the objective lens, the focus ring, and the ocular, then reassembled them on his Springfield's receiver with hand-fashioned rings and scavenged bolts. For the crosshair, he stripped a single wire from a field telephone cable and stretched it taut across a ring of dental cement. Crude, yes, but it worked. It wasn't pretty. It was precise. Every evening after dusk, he'd walk to a clearing known to the men as Red Hill, not for blood, but for the rust-red soil rich with iron. There, in the brittle quiet, he practiced. He set up rusted helmets on fence posts, 200 yards, 400, 600. Each night, he stepped back a little farther, the horizon folding away into cold mist. He recorded every shot, noting the angle of fall, how the lens behaved in freezing air. When fog crept into the glass, he found a solution, a thin film of soap rubbed and polished until invisible. Crude science, but science all the same. The others knew where he went. Some watched from a distance, amused. Others ignored him. The sergeant, stern but not cruel, warned him once, "You're wasting ammunition we don't have." Jack only replied once. "Sir," he said quietly, "I'll bring them back clean." By February 10th, intelligence reports began filtering in. More German armor movement near the Bois de Ligny, mostly Panzerkampfwagen foes. The Panzers had been the backbone of the Wehrmacht's armored divisions since the early years of the war. The variant in this sector, the AUSF-H, or H variant, was equipped with a 75mm high-velocity gun and frontal armor nearly 80 mm thick. For an infantryman, getting caught in the open by one of those was a sentence you didn't come back from. So Jack worked and waited, and when the time came, on that cold February afternoon, when smoke curled low and the air seemed to tremble with waiting, he lifted his rifle, exhaled slowly, and let his creation speak for itself. The valley held its breath. The echo rolled across the ridgeline like a sigh, and for a heartbeat, even the war went quiet. It was the kind of plan that made no sense, at least not on paper. Normally, you dealt with German armor the way the manuals said, call for air support, roll out the anti-tank guns, or, if you had the courage and desperation, get close enough with a bazooka to pray your aim was true. A rifle, even a sniper's rifle, had no place in that equation. Against steel and fire, a single bullet was nothing. But Jack wasn't trying to pierce armor. He had studied every line of the Panzervieh's blueprint, tracing them by candlelight like a mechanic memorizing the veins of a machine. He knew its habits, its anatomy, the heart of its engine buried beneath a deck of steel plates, and at the back, the fragile lungs of the beast, its fuel intake ports. Those caps, left exposed when refueling, were an engineer's oversight and a sniper's dream. Jack had seen them before, shiny, careless, hurriedly fastened during retreat or in the dimness before dawn. More than once, he had watched a convoy rumble by, extra canisters lashed to the rear with rope, jerry cans swaying like forgotten promises. They were convenient, yes, but vulnerable. He reasoned that if a single round could find that weakness, if it struck the canister or the open intake, it might not destroy the tank outright, but it could do something almost as valuable. Stop it, confuse the crew, force them out into the open, scatter their rhythm. And in war, chaos is often worth more than firepower. No one believed him, of course. Not yet. By February 11th, 1945, the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Infantry Regiment, had crept to the shadowed edge of the Bois de Lion, a dark forest hanging above a shallow French valley near the Marne River. The orders were clear. The 4th Infantry Division was to push east, crack through the remnants of the Wehrmacht's defensive pockets, and seize the ridgelines that would open the way for the spring offensive into Germany. But something in the reports didn't sit right. Scouts whispered of heavy treads moving through the mud at night, of the distant growl of engines that shouldn't have been there. The path through the trees was narrow and slick, hidden under the web of branches. From above, it was invisible, a perfect artery for armor. Intelligence confirmed the worst. At least 3 Panzer IVs were dug in on the western edge of the forest, cycling their watch every 6 hours. The Germans weren't retreating, they were preparing to stand. That morning, under a canvas roof streaked with condensation, Lieutenant Colonel Harris gathered his platoon leaders for a briefing. The air inside the tent smelled of damp wool and burnt coffee. He leaned over a rough field map, the kind drawn by hand when supply couldn't keep up, and said something unusual. He wanted a sharpshooter, someone patient, steady, invisible, to crawl out before dawn and take position overlooking the valley. The mission was deceptively simple. Observe, report, and, if the opportunity arose, disrupt. Pick off officers, stall their movements, cause confusion, but no noise, no heroics. Someone mentioned a name, Jack Bigham. Minutes later, Jack was called to the command tent. Harris studied him the way a mechanic studies a tool, curious, skeptical, but aware it might be exactly what he needed. "I hear you've been playing scientist with a rifle," Harris said flatly. "Yes, sir." "You think that thing of yours can hit anything past 400 yards? Jack didn't flinch. "I know it can, sir." There was no nod, no smile, just a map, creased, damp, and heavy with pencil marks, slid across the table toward him. A single point circled in red ink. Grid 17, Alpha. A rise of pine and shale, about 1,200 yards, from the reported tank positions. A clean line of sight, but impossibly long. Longer than doctrine, longer than the regulations had words for. "You'll go before dawn," Harris said quietly. "No backup, no noise, no second chances." "Yes, sir." That night, as frost crept over the fields like thin smoke, Jack packed his gear. The Springfield rifle with its sharping, handmade scope, 40 rounds of match-grade ammunition, each hand-picked and weighed, a pair of wire cutters, 2 canteens, 1 chocolate bar, no sidearm. He didn't expect to fight his way back. Under a bruised sky, he slipped away alone. His breath mingled with the cold air as he moved through the field, the frost crunching softly under his boots. By midnight, he had reached Grid 17 Alpha, a ridge crowned with dead pine needles and the faint scent of resin. There he dug in, carving a shallow scrape beneath a fallen tree. Above him, the moon played hide-and-seek with the clouds, casting long, trembling shadows that looked almost alive. The forest was still, eerily still, not even the chirp of a night bird. Only the distant heartbeat of artillery far to the east, pulsing through the ground like thunder smothered in cloth. Jack set to work, methodical as ever. He tested the scope, checked the zero, adjusted the dials he had etched with a carpenter's pencil weeks earlier. On a branch above him, he carved small notches, wind marks, crude but precise. Each line told him something about the invisible forces that could bend a bullet's path. He waited. For 6 long hours, he didn't move, not even to eat. The cold crept in, numbing his fingers, settling into his bones. But patience was his companion now, as constant as the rifle pressed against his shoulder. Just before dawn, a faint smudge appeared on the horizon, smoke coiling upward in slow motion. Then came the low groan of machinery, the heavy rhythm of treads grinding through mud. The Panzer appeared like a ghost emerging from the fog, its metal skin pale with frost. It rolled forward, paused just beyond the ridgeline, and idled, Steam hissed from its exhausts. A crewman, bareheaded, hurried, climbed out with a jerry can in his hands. He moved to the rear, unscrewed the cap, and began refueling. The sound carried faintly across the valley, a hollow metallic clink that echoed off the trees. Jack's heart slowed. Everything he had prepared for was now, right here, framed perfectly in his sight. One mistake, one exposed canister, one chance, 1,200 yards, a target no bigger than a lunchbox, 3 seconds of visibility. He breathed out. The world shrank to a single circle of glass. Across that mile of frozen earth, he saw it all. The frost on the Panzer's hull, the faint shimmer of exhaust, the shape of the man bending low. No spotter, no second set of eyes, just Jack and his invention, the scope everyone had mocked. He wasn't aiming for the tank's heart. He was aiming for its breath, for the vulnerable place where fuel met air. He remembered the diagrams, the fuel cap positioned near the right intake vent, often left ajar. The Germans were efficient, but even efficiency breaks down when you're tired and cold. The crosshair, a strand of wire pulled from a field telephone, painted by hand with a drop of enamel, hovered over the jerry can. A faint breeze touched the grass, west to east, 3 miles per hour, maybe less. Jack adjusted 1/4 inch left. At this range, that was life or failure. He inhaled, held it, squeezed. The rifle bucked gently against his shoulder. The shot cracked across the valley like a whip. Then, nothing. The silence was unbearable, infinite. Even the birds seemed to wait. And then, light. A single spark blossomed into orange flame. The jerry can burst first, a flash like sunrise caught too soon. The man stumbled back, swallowed by smoke. A second figure darted forward, shouting something Jack couldn't hear. Then the fire spread, crawling up the rear grates of the Panzer, slipping between seams of metal, like a living thing. A heartbeat later, the tank convulsed from within. The sound came delayed, a deep metallic roar that rolled through the valley and up the ridge like a storm breaking. Fire surged through the vents, and the Panzer erupted, a bloom of black and orange that painted the pine trees in brief, terrible daylight. Jack didn't move, his finger lifted from the trigger. Below, chaos unfurled. German troops scattered, shouting into the fog, pointing at shadows that weren't there. Some ran for cover, others froze, trying to locate an enemy that existed only as an echo. Back across the valley, on the American side, the men of the 2 to 3 watched in disbelief. They'd heard one shot, then the fire, then the explosion. For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone whispered, "No way. That wasn't Bigham, was it?" Another answered softly, "He's the only one out there." When Jack finally crawled back through the tree line, the sun was already high. His hands were raw, scraped from the frozen dirt. His face was pale and speckled with dried earth. He looked older somehow. When he reached the forward post, no one laughed. No one called him Crazy Jack or the scientist. They just watched him pass, silent, their eyes following the man who had done the impossible. In the distance, the valley still murmured with the echo of that single shot. It lingered in the cold morning air, a faint metallic whisper that seemed to hang between the branches, like the sound of history, breathing. They looked at the rifle, then the scope, then him. No medals, no ceremony, just quiet awe. Jack Brigham had just done the impossible, a shot with a rifle no one trusted, and a scope no one believed in. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than the mockery that had filled the barracks only a day before. When Jack returned to base that afternoon, the world outside the wire was unchanged. The same gray sky, the same wind brushing over shell-torn earth. But something in the air had shifted. The men looked at him differently now. Their words came slower, their tones softer, as if they were all quietly recalibrating what they thought was possible. The man they'd once called Scope Boy, the tinkerer with a foolish dream, now walked among them with a stillness that carried weight. Not because he demanded respect, but because he had earned it the hard way, one impossible shot at a time. The story traveled faster than the wind. Within hours, Lieutenant Colonel Harris received word from battalion headquarters. German radio intercepts had reported a suspected American sniper strike on an armored unit. The burning Panzer, its serial number still unknown, had been part of a mobile counterattack force meant to halt the 4th Infantry's eastward advance. It never got the chance. Jack's single, improbable shot had crippled that movement, and with it, shifted the tempo of a battlefield that was supposed to be predictable. By the next dawn, the enemy had already adapted. Tank crews began revising their routines. Fuel canisters now stored farther from the rear deck, refueling delayed until vehicles were under cover, hatches sealed shut, except when absolutely necessary. Those weren't changes made from rumor, they were born from fear. Somewhere in the fog of war, a single man with a handmade optic had made an entire column of steel rethink its certainty. Command took notice. At dawn, Jack was summoned for a debrief. The officers at the 23rd wanted to know everything, his process, his calculations, his strange scope that had somehow rewritten part of armored warfare. Jack carried it in, the handmade optic, its casing darkened by soot and frost, looking more like a relic than a weapon. He laid it gently on the table, and as he explained, the room leaned closer. He told them how he had cannibalized parts from a broken Bosch and Lahm microscope, how he'd calibrated the lenses through patient trial and error, and how the reticle came from a single strand of wire stripped from a communication cable. His voice stayed even, practical, without boast or flourish, just method and memory. For the first time, they took notes, real ones. Lieutenant Colonel Harris leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Could you teach this?" he asked quietly. Jack met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, sir." The next week, Jack was temporarily reassigned to division-level training, not to boast, but to share. A handful of riflemen from across the 4th Infantry gathered to learn his methods. His lessons were simple, almost plain-spoken. Improvise with precision. Measure everything. Trust your instincts. But verify them with data. The men listened in silence, many of them humbled by the calm authority of a man who'd never sought the spotlight. One afternoon, a sergeant who had once mocked him asked to see the scope up close. Jack handed it over without a word. The man lifted it to the light, frowned, then chuckled softly. "This thing's ugly," he muttered, "but damn, it works." Word of that moment spread beyond their camp like a whispered legend. Another battalion sent a runner requesting a demonstration. A major from division staff arrived unannounced, asking for a written report. No one could quite believe that a piece of scrap metal and solder had achieved what precision factories hadn't, the outthinking of a tank. It wasn't brute force that stopped that Panzer, it was ingenuity. And Jack never gloated. He wasn't built for that. In the evenings, while others talked or drank, he stayed by his bench, rechecking the scope, cleaning the rifle's bolt, running his thumb along the barrel's cool steel, as if it were the crankshaft of an engine. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing reliability, the quiet perfection that kept men alive. The rifle, the scope, the shot. They had become one story now. His story. And though he never sought attention, the army had begun watching him closely, because in a war of machines and mass production, Jack Brigham had proven something profoundly human. That sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't what you're issued, it's what you build with your own hands. The war dragged on for 3 more months. When it ended, it did so not with fanfare, but with silence. In May 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered, The guns went quiet. Across Europe, the cities lay in ruin, their skylines reduced to jagged silhouettes. Fields from Champagne to Normandy were littered with rusting steel and half-buried memories. For most soldiers, including Jack, there were no parades, no grand farewells, just orders. Orders to pack up, return home, and, if possible, forget. Jack went back to Kansas that summer. The town of Marshall welcomed him not with brass bands, but with quiet nods. His parents had kept his workshop exactly as he'd left it. The same tools, the same cracked magnifier, even his notebook still open on the table. A single penciled note reading 3 seconds drift at 500 yards. When neighbors asked about the war, he'd smile faintly and say, "I did my part." That was enough. The rifle came home with him too. The same Springfield M110-3A4. The same scarred scope patched with wire and glue. It sat locked away for years, gathering dust, but never forgotten. In the 1950s, Jack was invited to a local veterans gathering. He brought the rifle and scope, not as trophies, but as proof. Proof of what a man could achieve when necessity and belief met in the same pair of hands. The audience listened quietly as he spoke, not just about the shot, but about the ridicule before it, the trial, the quiet persistence that followed. He ended his talk with a sentence that would one day be etched in brass beside his display at the Kansas War Museum. It was never about the scope. It was about believing I could make something better, even when no one else did. The Army never formally adopted his design, but stories travel in ways regulations never can. During Korea and even Vietnam, instructors told new recruits about the Kansas boy who built his own scope and changed the game. The details were often exaggerated, war stories always are, but the essence remained. One soldier's willingness to think differently had made a measurable difference. In the late 1970s, a military historian researching improvised weapons from World War II tracked Jack down. They spoke for hours at his kitchen table. Jack opened a padded case lined with flannel, revealing the scope like a relic from another time. The historian took careful notes, later publishing a small chapter in a book titled Tools of Last Resort: Ingenuity in Combat. That same year, Jack donated both the rifle and the scope to the Kansas Military History Center. They remain there today, sealed in glass, beneath a faded photograph. A young man with a square jaw, steady eyes, and grease-stained fingers. Most visitors pass by without pause, but a few stop. They lean closer, tracing the scratches on the steel, reading the small caption beneath the glass. And in that quiet moment, they understand. This was never a story about a decorated hero. It was the story of a mechanic who refused to accept the word impossible. Jack Brigham never sought legacy, but he left one anyway. One bullet had changed doctrine. He never saw himself as a strategist. He had no stars on his shoulders, no war room maps. He was a corporal, a field man, a practitioner with a craftsman's mind. Yet history often moves not through planners, but through doers. In the months following that fateful Panzer incident, Jack's story quietly threaded its way through after-action reports and whispered accounts. It was never formal doctrine, but its lesson endured, that the Army had underestimated the power of field innovation. Jack had taken broken optics, scrap wire, and fragments of steel, and built something that worked, not in theory, but under fire. And somewhere, in that faint hum between ingenuity and survival, his legacy still lingers, like the echo of a single rifle shot carried by the wind across an empty field. Steady, distant, but never forgotten. That alone was a lesson in resourcefulness, a quiet testament to the power of human hands when the odds leave no room for hesitation. But there was more hidden in Jack's shot than just ingenuity. He had exposed something the Army hadn't yet recognized, a tactical blind spot buried deep within its own doctrine. For years, sniper training had been aimed at flesh and uniform: infantrymen, officers, machine gun nests, forward observers. Few ever imagined that a man with a rifle could change the way armored warfare unfolded. Jack proved otherwise. Under the right conditions, he showed that a single, well-placed shot could cripple what even artillery sometimes failed to destroy. Not by piercing the armor, but by striking at the unseen weakness behind it. It was an act of understanding more than aggression, a moment when perception itself became a weapon. In the months that followed, reports quietly rippled through the channels of command. After-action reviews began to include new sections, cautious but curious. They spoke of identifying soft points, of understanding machinery as a living system with veins and arteries, not just plates and bolts. It was the kind of revelation that shifted thinking, even if the name Jack Brigham never appeared in print. By the late 1940s, a small clause appeared in a post-war field manual, just one unassuming line among thousands of others. Personnel should be trained to identify and exploit exposed support elements of mechanized units when conditions permit. It was bureaucratic language, stripped of poetry or pride, but that single sentence had been born from a rifleman's quiet defiance in a French forest, and from it, a subtle current began to move. Jack's achievement sparked something else, something larger than any tactical note or field adjustment. It reignited the long simmering debate over sniper doctrine itself. During the Second World War, the U.S. military had lagged behind both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army when it came to precision marksmanship. The Soviets had trained over 20,000 snipers by the war's end, each carrying rifles with optics refined by years of necessity and bitter experience. The Germans, for their part, were renowned for their optical superiority, the clean geometry of Zeiss lenses, and the ruthless efficiency of their training. Against them, the American approach often felt improvised, decentralized, shaped by whatever tools or trainers were available. Jack's crude, homemade scope, a contraption of scavenged glass and solder, posed an uncomfortable question. What if, instead of waiting for orders or equipment from above, soldiers were trusted to innovate at the front? What if initiative wasn't chaos, but creativity? His invention, born from desperation and intellect, forced leaders to reconsider what discipline truly meant. It wasn't just obedience, it was adaptability. By the 1950s, that question began to take root. The Army started investing in optic standardization and formal sniper training programs. Workshops replaced improvisation, manuals replaced instinct, but the spirit behind them came from the same place. By the time Vietnam rolled around, snipers were no longer lone wanderers in the doctrine. They were seen as strategic assets, essential instruments in a new kind of war. Rifles had grown sharper, optics clearer, doctrine, finally, more deliberate. No one credited Jack Brigham directly, but beneath the paperwork and procurement orders, his fingerprints were there. He had proven something fundamental, that battlefield intelligence wasn't only about collecting information. It was about recognizing when the ground itself demanded change. The battlefield, after all, is not static. It breathes, it learns, and those who listen to its rhythm survive. Even today, modern training programs echo that same understanding. Soldiers are taught not just to shoot, but to see, to read the landscape of steel and shadow, to find the hidden joints and fragile seams of machines that seem indestructible. They're trained to think critically under pressure, to innovate when supply fails, to fabricate what doesn't exist yet. None of that came from a textbook. It came from a man crouched behind a rifle in a frostbitten forest, who believed that standard issue was never the same as only option. One shot, one scope, one act of quiet defiance against the machinery of doctrine. From that, a ripple spread through generations of marksmen, engineers, and soldiers, each carrying the unspoken truth that precision is not always about the tool. Sometimes it's about the will behind it. History tends to remember its heroes through monuments and medals. names carved into stone, victories cataloged by date and map. But the real shaping of history often happens in quieter corners, not with parades or declarations, but with a single choice, a single hand-built solution, a single refusal to give in. Jack Brigham never shouted his achievements. He never wrote memoirs or demanded recognition. He never sought to reform the army. He simply did his job, with thought, with heart, with the steady patience of a craftsman who believed that doing something right mattered more than being seen doing it. His story, one man, one rifle, one handmade scope, stands as a quiet argument against how we often define courage and innovation. His moment didn't blaze like a cinematic finale. It arrived in stillness. It was the calm breath before the trigger's pull, the silent conviction that he could see what others could not. In that stillness, in that brief alignment of thought and steel, the impossible became possible. Most of us live our lives surrounded by manuals, rules that tell us to wait for permission, to follow the line, to not question the process. But every leap humanity has ever made, every discovery, every invention, every act of bravery, has started with someone whispering, "This isn't good enough. I can make it better." Jack's scope, clumsy and imperfect, wasn't merely an optical device. It was a statement. It declared that ideas matter, even when they seem absurd. That persistence often looks foolish until it works. That the difference between failure and breakthrough is sometimes just the stubbornness to keep going when the laughter hasn't yet died down. Picture that battlefield again, mud clinging to boots, the distant thunder of artillery rolling like an angry sky. Every instinct tells a soldier to conform, to stay predictable, to avoid risk. And yet, in that world of uniformity and iron, one man used a broken microscope and a ring of enemy shrapnel to change the course of a battle. Not by defying orders, but by thinking beyond them. Now, in our own age, one filled with precision-engineered tools, factory-perfect instruments, and digital certainty, the spirit that drove Jack Brigham still matters, because we face challenges that no blueprint can solve. We live in a time that still requires the kind of mind willing to say, if it doesn't exist, I'll build it. Maybe that's you. Maybe somewhere inside, there's a scope of your own, waiting to be assembled from the scraps life has handed you. Perhaps you've been told your idea won't work, that it's impractical, strange, unnecessary, that no one's ever done it that way. Maybe that's exactly why you should keep going. Jack's story reminds us that innovation isn't confined to laboratories or command centers. It's a way of thinking, a refusal to accept the limits imposed by habit. Sometimes, the smallest change, born in quiet persistence, can travel farther than any of us imagine. One man, one lens, one bullet. A moment that still speaks across 8 decades. A whisper carried through time, reminding us that ingenuity and courage are rarely loud, but always enduring. And now, it's your turn. What part of Jack Brigham's story stays with you? Was it the laughter he endured, the silence that followed his shot, or the legacy he never meant to leave behind? Maybe it's the question hidden between those lines. What could you build if you stopped waiting for permission? Tell us. Because your story matters. History, after all, isn't built only by those who are remembered. It's built by those who dare to begin. And if this story moved you, share it. Somewhere out there, someone else is staring at their own version of that homemade scope, wondering if it's enough. Maybe your belief in them is the spark they've been waiting for. Then, in the hush that follows, imagine the faint sound of a bolt sliding home, the echo of precision, faith, and quiet defiance, still resonating through the years.